So this is our Simondon reading group, continuing our reading of Individuation, Volume 2, on the text History of the Notion of the Individual. We're picking up from page 608 of the PDF, the section on Montesquieu. So last time we finished the very long section on Rousseau, and then we saw there's a little sort of transition section about the 18th century and sort of a general picture of the 18th century. And so he talks about a few of the different, I guess, philosophical schools or traditions that were active in the 18th century. But he looks at, I think, the individualism that is sort of characteristic of moral and political philosophy of a lot of these writers in the 18th century. And so there's this idea that society is essentially composed of atomic individuals. So the individual is ontologically or logically prior or more fundamental than the social order in which they're incorporated. And then society is essentially an aggregate of individuals. And there's also this sort of one of the, I guess, consequences of this individualism is the theory of enlightened despotism. So the idea that the sort of ideal order for a society is one in which you have an enlightened despot, a ruler who has a philosophical understanding of human nature and of the ideal society, and then sort of works to realize that ideal. So this is the ideal of some of the Enlightenment authors of the 18th century. They sort of propose this model as being the way to realize Enlightenment ideas. And the idea of this enlightened despotism sort of leads to a kind of universal regulation of society. So every aspect, nothing in society should be left to chance. Everything should be regulated and ordered in such a way as to promote the general interest of society. And so it's sort of paradoxical, I guess, that this position that starts from the individual as being the fundamental reality ends up with a social order in which the individual is completely subordinated to the general regulation of that society. So individuals would be sort of assigned to particular tasks, and everything would be sort of ordained from the summit of the society in the enlightened despot. And then he also mentions, just sort of in passing, the idea of static and dynamic equilibrium in analyses of society and the development of societies. And he suggests that most of these authors of the Enlightenment think of society in terms of a static equilibrium. So it's a state that is supposed to stay the same, and the sort of general problem of political theory is to figure out what sort of arrangement is most stable and would prevent changes. Whereas a dynamic approach to social order would be one in which you want to, the problem is to figure out what kind of social order has the capacity to transform itself. And this is something that is only really developed in the 19th century with the idea of progress as one of the sort of central principles of social order. So a society is good or is well ordered insofar as it allows for progress. And so this sort of dynamic conception of social order is only, so Simondon attributes it to Vico. He says perhaps Vico has this sort of dynamic conception of social order, but he thinks that in the 18th century, most authors are still using this static conception of social order instead. So that section is a sort of preview of what we see in the next few sections. So he does a sort of a quick tour of some of the 18th century authors and their social theories and how the individual fits into those theories. So that's what we'll see probably today and maybe next week as well. Okay, so let's start reading. If someone else would like to read from the Montesquieu heading.
Yeah, I can read. Montesquieu. In the time of Montesquieu, The representation of the individual that coincides with this static social static equilibrium is quite similar to the representation Descartes elaborated. Man is free due to intelligence, not because of his alleged independence relative to the order of creatures submitted to fixed laws. Quote, as an intelligent being, he incessantly violates the laws that God established and incessantly changes those that he himself establishes. The laws God has made are themselves this way, quote, because they have some relationship with his wisdom and his power, unquote. The necessity that guides man is a sort of necessity of convenience. This necessity is discovered based on the man who searches through calculation and reflection for the laws that are the best in a given historical situation. Legislation is therefore like mechanical combinations, which an inventor knows how to discover and institute. These combinations are regulated by the eternal laws of movement, and yet they wait for the inventor to realize them. Such is the role of the individual, the being who is capable of invention, the being in whom human freedom is revealed essentially. The problem to be resolved is the same for legislation as for a mechanical combination. It is that of maximum effect. As with Descartes, Malebranche, and Leibniz, here we come upon the search for this parameter that is information and that can characterize a political system as a mechanical system. The individual as inventor is an operator of information. Montesquieu compares the various political systems according to this larger or smaller quantity of information, which is also a greater or lesser degree of freedom. There is a minimum of freedom when public powers act in a completely arbitrary and unregulated way. Each of these powers must therefore be limited and controlled by a force that balances them out. The force that is opposed to the arbitrariness of a public power must be homogeneous with it, must be another public power. Consequently, there will be political freedom when the homogeneous powers will balance each other mutually. This search for the condition of the highest degree of information for a social static equilibrium leads to the discovery of principles like those that define monarchy. Quote, in monarchies, policy affects great things with as little virtue as possible. Thus, in the nicest machines, art has reduced the number of movements, springs, and wheels, unquote. The general principle is the following. Quote, to form a moderate government, it is necessary to combine the several powers, to regulate, temper, and set them in motion, to give, as it were, ballast to one in order to enable it to counterpoise the other. This is a masterpiece of legislation rarely produced by chance, unquote. Montesquieu even foresaw the existence of a principle of degradation in opposition to the realization of a very high degree of perfection in the informed system. Mechanics indeed has its frictions, this is a quote, mechanics indeed has its frictions which often change or arrest the effects of the theory. Politics also has its own frictions, unquote. The individual's essential role in politics is therefore to comprehend so as to be able to invent. Yeah, this is an interesting way to talk about Montesquieu. I read a little bit of Montesquieu in grad school just because it's, relevant to constitutional issues. Obviously, he was a very influential thinker on the framers of the American Constitution, the doctrine of separation of powers. But this, framing it in terms of invention and information, it seems like he's saying that the information is the creation of the political system through kind of the study of these laws that are like mechanical laws. Does that sound right?
I think that's pretty much right. So we saw with Simondon's analysis of Descartes that in that passage he talks about how the Descartes' argument for the existence of God is that I have the idea of a perfect being within me, and this idea contains more reality than I, as a finite, imperfect being, can produce. And so this idea has to be produced in me by a perfect being, namely God. And Simondon analyzes this argument in terms of information. So he says this this idea of the perfect being is this idea of a being that contains all reality contains more information or has this high information content, and it's because of this information content that the idea sort of surpasses my capacities as a finite being. And then, so here in this text, or in this section on Malebranche, or sorry, on Montesquieu, um, he he analyzes the creation of political systems in similar terms as a work of information. And the question is, how can you sort of assemble political powers or political principles in such a way that the information content is not lost over time as a result of these frictions, or I guess sort of historical contingencies that put stress on a political system. um, and um, and so this is a work of invention, in the sense that you have to sort of analyze the nature of political systems and these mechanical laws that govern them, and use that knowledge to assemble these elements or principles or political powers in such a way that the system is self-sustaining and doesn't degrade over time. So I think that's so. This is still in the terms of the transition piece that we just talked about. It's still a kind of static equilibrium, but it's one in which the mechanical laws of transformation of political systems are sort of incorporated into the understanding of the static equilibrium that is the goal of political invention.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it does, like it's obviously not progressive in the sense, or dynamic in the sense in which you were just discussing, in relation to Vico. But it does seem like it's not like in a state of equilibrium in which all of the potential has been exhausted, because it seems like the stasis is kind of maintained by the tension between the different branches which hold each other in check, which I guess could be seen as a kind of potential energy.
Yeah, so like in the functioning of a machine, if it's say a pulley that you use to lift a weight or whatever exactly the machine is, it has there are certain forces that act within the functioning of that machine. So you use the force, the gravitational force that pulls a weight down on one end to lift a weight on the other end, for example. So there's a sort of complex interaction of the forces that act on the different parts of the machine. And I think that's sort of the model here, is that you have all these different political forces that are sort of acting on each other in various ways, and the art of the inventor is to put those forces into connection in such a way that the whole thing remains stable. And So the potentials here, the role of potential in this model, I think, is prior to the invention, or prior to the act of the legislator. So there's the potential lies sort of in the political elements themselves, and the various laws that govern their interaction. And then out of that potential, the legislator sort of assembles this complex machine, and then that machine is meant to be stable as long as possible. And I mean, I don't know Montesquieu very well, but I think the idea is to sort of preserve the stability of that machine, and not to have any sort of development or capacity for transformation built into the machine itself. So I think the potential comes before the legislator sets up the political machine, and not after the machine is already established.
And that's why you have to have a bunch of unelected wizards who just make the country's laws on their own.
Yeah, and that's sort of the division of powers principle is that by dividing political power among these different wizards, you balance them against each other, and that sort of leads to the stability that you desire. But and you can see why this would be, or why a sort of anti-democratic argument would be sort of in harmony with this way of thinking, because if you allow for election of officials, or sort of democratic decision making in general, then there's no sort of guarantee that these different officials will balance each other in the right way. So you could have, I don't know, the executive and the legislative branches could sort of collude with each other to suppress the judicial branch or whatever, some other combination like that. So you can have all sorts of different, like the relationships between the branches would not be established in the way that Montesquieu seems to think is the ideal way for preserving the stability of this political order.
So thinking about the process here, described like I just like I can just think of the process of individuation. Like here, individuals are regarded as a kind of a potential in the process of psychic individuation, as far as I understand. And I'm wondering if my understanding is right or wrong. And then secondly, I'm wondering what exactly information means here, because it was like information like in Simondon's individuation theory confusing for me. What exactly information here means?
Yeah, those are a couple of good questions. I'll start with the second one because I think information here. I think, and it's not 100% clear, but I think Simondon was using it in his own sort of particular sense, as opposed to information as the content of a message that can be transmitted. So the signal of information is what Simondon uses. The term Simondon uses to describe the sort of communication theory notion of information. But here he's talking about information in, I guess, the ontological sense. So it has to do with the capacity of some entity to structure some domain that is unstructured. And like the standard example is his crystallization example, where the germ crystal has the capacity to structure the fluid and crystallize it into this realized structure. And so likewise here, the inventor of a political system or the legislator has the capacity to bring about the structuration of the social order. So whereas before the legislator intervenes, there's this sort of chaotic, social order that has been developed just by chance, and then the legislator comes in and sort of imposes a structure on the social order. And so this invention of a stable social order is an act that creates information in the sense that it brings about a structuration of something that was previously unstructured. I think that's the sense of information here.
Sounds like the seed of, as you said, like a crystallization, like it's like a germ, like to generate something new, like.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. So that's sort of the image that Simondo always has in mind, I think, when he's talking about information. But it's a little bit different here because in this case, there's so in the case of the crystal, the germ crystal already contains information in a sort of realized state. So it already has a certain structure, and then that structure has the capacity to bring about a structuration of a previously unstructured domain. Whereas in this case, there's an act of creation of information, an act of invention on the part of the legislator. So it's that act of creation of information, I think, is what Simondon is interested in analyzing here, and it's this sort of creativity of producing new information. I think is sort of the key moment of the whole process of information that Simondon tries to highlight and separate out from the rest.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, and then the other question was about the role of the individual here, and I think, at least the way Simondon is depicting it here, the only true individual in the whole political order is the legislator who actually creates that social or the political order. It's only this person who invents the political structure and thereby is producing new information. It's only that person who is truly an individual, whereas everyone else in the social order is just sort of playing a role and has their role that is sort of assigned to them and counterbalanced by someone else. Like Spinoza, but substance is Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So you just everyone is sort of playing a role that is assigned by this legislator who comes up with the political system. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So there's again, I mentioned this last time, but in the French text, and I'm not sure if this is Simondon's doing or the editors, but there's a line break here that is not reproduced in the English translation. So this next bit is again a sort of transition or a preview of what comes next. So let's just read that from in a general way to up to the heading Kondiak. If someone else would like to read.
Let me read. Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in a general way, above all, in the second half of the 18th century, the conditions of philosophical thought define a certain manner of envisioning the problem of the individual that will not be encountered afterward. The rise of the third estate permits the individual to feel his force otherwise than in the heroism of a battle and the mysterious drive that leads to the countries of the infidel, or in the discovery of the vast system of thought that incorporates everything a human being can think. In the 17th century, the necessity of the system was for a philosopher the obligation for each individual thought to attain the universality of representation and action. In the 18th century, on the contrary, universality is distributed amongst the numerous members of a team. This is no longer the era of the founders who discover a method, but that of the realizers who, having divided up the task, cooperate eagerly with the realization and advent of an order. We should also note that this synergy of efforts infinitely easier to realize for an enterprise of destruction than for construction, which always requires a plan for the whole. The effort of critique is cumulative by itself. Result adds on to results, like the progression of the dilapidation in an established order. There is no need for a system in order to attack. Method is sufficient. This is why all it took was the resilience of the political order and of prejudices to dynamically give coherence to the efforts of all the philosophies of the Enlightenment. The situation of the individual in this effort of attack directed against the prejudices and the political order consists in an attitude that does not seek to assume the universality of the vision of the world, nor does it seek to absolutely assume the universality of the individual's place in the world. Those who would wish to do so are qualified as visionaries. This is the attitude of critique and hostility, which, in this open term, realizes a coherence that lasts for as long as the activity of critique lasts. If the problem of individuality no longer seems to exist for the philosophers of the Enlightenment, that is because this problem could only be posed through a total vision of a being, i.e., of the society in which he struggles, against which he rises up, and which constitutes the focal point of all these efforts. The center of the system, the point that forms the unity of this attitude, is that there is a given, namely an ensemble of social, political, intellectual, affective structures that form a unity of the goal. That of the thing to be destroyed, and the unity of being, insofar as the thing to be destroyed exists. There is thus an intellectual hypothetical that conditions the activity of the philosophers of the 18th century, that of the fact that it is the state of society, and thought that at the moment in which these beings who are aware of their individuality live. If individuality takes on the form of an essentially dynamic being in expansion, that is because this apparently unconditional dynamism was realized by the conditions of intellectual activity in the second half of the 18th century. What is found in the philosophy of the Enlightenment is not a refusal of the systematic unity and universality of the reflection, but an implementation of the conditions of thought or temporarily favorable to a thought that can be unleashed from the reflections aspect of universality. The thought of counter-erosion was like the intellectual compensation for this lack of universality with a contrary lack of universality. It is therefore necessary to comprehend a certain aspect, the individualism of the ancient 18th century, as an attitude that expresses exceptional circumstances, whose counterpart is the systematical and opposite attitude. A reflexive study must unite these two attitudes, which only pose the complete problems of the individuality in their relation. By contrast, the sociological and or biological thought of the 19th century will again attempt to pose the problem of individuality in its universality, precisely so as to escape from this impasse in which the knowledge of man was engaged in the debate between the century of enlightenment and and the thought of writers like Burke or Georges de Maistre and Bunal.
Right. So this bit, because it's a sort of transition and preview of what's coming next, it's somewhat abstract and not 100% clear, I would say. But I think the idea, well, there's a few different points to bring out of this passage. One is the destructive role of the Enlightenment philosophy. So the only sort of unity that the Enlightenment had was precisely this role of criticism and destruction of the existing social order. And he's thinking primarily here of France. So you have people like Voltaire and Diderot who were opposed to the monarchy and the clergy and sort of worked to try to bring about the downfall of that particular social order. And so this, what united them was essentially just this critical or destructive function, and there was little or nothing that united them in terms of a positive vision of what the human being is or should be, or what the social order is or should be. So it's in this sense that Simondon describes the Enlightenment philosophers as having a partial picture of the individual. So they only have a sort of negative conception of what the individual is not or what the individual should not be, and they don't come up with a real positive conception of what the individual is. And we have sort of opposed to the Enlightenment, there are these counter-Enlightenment writers like Burke, who defend tradition and who deny the capacity of reason to sort of bring about a new social order better than an existing one. And these authors are likewise only sort of negative. They just they deny the capacity of reason to perform these improvements of the social order, but they don't really give a sort of positive account of what that social order consists in, other than a sort of vague notion of tradition. And so each side of the Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment, they both have a partial conception of the individual, a merely negative conception of the individual. And so for Simondon, it's only in the 19th century that we get a sort of total picture of the individual that doesn't just sort of negatively depict one side or the other. And then I think another point worth highlighting here is Simondon sort of sketches, he doesn't go into a lot of detail about it, but he suggests that this sort of individual, this negative conception of the individual, or this destructive conception of the role of philosophy, is conditioned by the rise of the Third Estate in France, and so the historical circumstance where you have a society in which the Third Estate is politically very limited in terms of its power, but in terms of the sort of general social order, the Third Estate is increasingly important, and so the monarchy is increasingly reliant on the Third Estate for financial purposes, but then at the same time, the Third Estate is sort of excluded from the leadership of the political realm. So this sort of tension between the social importance of the third estate and the political impotence is sort of the background in which we find philosophy having this negative or critical role as sort of the project or unifying principle for philosophy. And so Simondon here, I think we've seen a few instances of this type of argument, I think, from Simondon, where he tries to give a social explanation of a particular philosophical position or a sort of general philosophical movement or something like that. And so here he only just sort of sketches it, but I think it's worth sort of pointing out that principle or that form of explanation that he gives here.
Definitely. This all changes. Like, I mean, the part that page 611 something like that. And that the first part is like is description of the changes of the according to the century. Has to do, those changes have to do with the historical contextual the backgrounds, like, so only it can be just only like we can just think of this kind of changes only limited to the Western societies, right? Like it could be a little bit different, like in, for example, in Asian context or other historically different contexts, it could be different. So what Simondon described here is only like what happened in Western society, like that is kind of like the idea, right?
Yeah, and he not just Western society, but I think he's specifically thinking of France because this is all sort of in relation to the French Revolution, where the French Enlightenment philosophy was part of the ideology of the French Revolution. So a lot of the actors of the French Revolution, appealed to the writings of the French Enlightenment authors as sort of motivating their actions or justifying their actions. And then likewise, the counter Enlightenment, these were people, so Burke in particular, wrote a book sort of denouncing the French Revolution. And the counter Enlightenment was in general motivated by opposition to the French Revolution and arguing that this was unjust or unjustified in various ways. And so yeah, there's the political background that Simondon was thinking about is specifically the French one. So definitely in other countries, this process would have happened in different ways, or there would be different processes happening.
The reason why I asked this, like, in Simondon's individuation theory, I'm always like wondering if the Simondon's individuation theory can be universally applied to the all the context in the world or something like that. So kind of like a potential or all kind of like a generation, ontological generation, something like that can be applied to the all the context. That's what I believe for now, but. Yeah, that could be right. I mean, like at the end of the day, like Simondon generated his own theory based on just all kind of his research, but his own idea can be applied to the diverse contexts as well, right?
Yeah, I think at least in terms of his sort of ideal, what he's trying to do, I don't think he wants to limit his account of individuation to a specific social and historical context. But I think if we take a sort of broad view of this whole text on the history of the notion of the individual, I think he sees the development of philosophy over the centuries, going back to the pre-Socratics, and we'll see it ends in the early 19th century. This whole history is itself a process of individuation in which the notion of the individual comes to be better and better defined. And so there's a process in which the individual, the notion of the individual is itself undergoing a process of individuation. And we can think, my knowledge of like Chinese or Indian philosophy or other philosophical traditions is pretty limited, but you could probably do a similar kind of analysis of any of those philosophical traditions and try to see, how the notion of the individual develops in those philosophical traditions, and like seeing how there's a process of individuation of that notion of the individual in those traditions as well. But yeah, that would be like a whole research project that Simon Rowe doesn't undertake or really acknowledge.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Yeah, Ollie, your comment makes me think that how cool it would be if there was like Simon Doan had written a history of the notion of the individual in like Chinese history or something.
Yeah, I mean that would be again a whole like life project of mastering Chinese philosophy and being able to analyze its history in that way. That obviously Simon Dong was educated in the French context where there's this tradition of Western philosophy and very little attention to philosophy outside of the Western tradition. But yeah, that would be if someone who had the knowledge of Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy or any other tradition could try to carry out that project, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, true. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I think we have a couple of short. Well, that's about a page. Yeah, let's read the Condillac section. 61. Do you have a mic this week, or do you want to read?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm here. Where are we in the text?
Yeah, so we're on page 611 at the heading Condillac.
Okay. It's pronounced Condillac. Okay. All right. I can read. Condillac becomes aware of the logical power of the individual being who possesses a veritable manufacturing faculty of ideas and carries out their genesis within himself. Quote, our errors stem from the fact that our ideas are badly made. The only way to correct them is to remake them. Intelligence or reason is not a natural block that its origin must justify by explaining it. It is a sort of building or factory. The whole future of the mind is engaged in this work of reform, of reconstruction by means of philosophical reflection, which will allow it to remake better what was made spontaneously. All truths arrive from the operation of individual intelligence. In the language of calculation, Condillac does not introduce any definition, any maxim, and produces all the truths of the operation of calculation. Symbols come from the senses. These are, quote, the simplest ideas that the senses transmit to us, a sort of inert manner for the mind which will combine them. The development of the mind occurs due to the diversity of the connections established according to utility. In the end, it's a question of, quote, knowing how to form these links in accordance with the aim one proposes in the circumstances in which one finds oneself. The individual should then no longer withdraw into solitude, for inner invention is less abundant and more limited than reality. The presence of the world and of society is not an entertaining diversion, but the occasion of experience, which provides a matter to our mind's activity of elaboration. The indefinite possibility of this progressive labor ensures a dynamic unity for the individual being. The encyclopedic nature of reflection manifests as a presence of the individual to the whole richness of this experience. The individual's connection to the whole is this manufacturing activity of the individual. Quote, philosophy is no longer the science of a man who meditates with eyes closed. It values all the arts. In order for this constructive method to be valid and fruitful everywhere, it suffices to be able to establish between signs and ideas a correspondence as rigorous as that which mathematics realizes, in such a way that every word is determined there in a fixed and invariable manner. The deductive synthesis is a fruitless method and a teacher of errors. Only analysis is valid. The vices of the great systems are understood in this way, as the treatise on systems reveals. Thanks to this method of construction, an individual who would have nothing but a single sense would possess an understanding with as many faculties as with 5 altogether. It is the statue of the treatise on the sensations that shows this independence of the 5 senses with respect to one another. It is quite similar to the man of the essay on the origin of human knowledge, who in a state of spiritual innocence, sheltered from prejudices and traditions, would be created by God with organs so well developed that from the very first moments he would have a perfect use of reason. This individual in the state of nature would perfectly realize within himself a perfect constructive genesis of thought without any preliminary system. The treatise on the sensations only goes further than the essay by striving to show that all mental faculties are anterior to the use of signs. The art of signs only teaches to, quote, take the light further. Therefore, from the very beginning, the individual would possess these mental faculties, those that seem to be superior to this primitive stage, For example, to the primitive capacity independent of any sign to know how to count to 3, are, quote, only these same faculties which, applying to a large number of objects, develop further. The role of signs makes it possible for the individual to operate this extension.
Right. So Condillac was an empiricist philosopher. It's interesting also, just sort of in passing, that Simonon doesn't actually mention Locke or doesn't have a section on Locke in this text, because Condillac is definitely influenced by Locke. But maybe that's just sort of the French bias from Simondon. Yeah, so Condillac, the bit about the statue, I think I mentioned this before, but so in the treatise on the sensations, Condillac does a sort of thought experiment of you start with a statue, and then you give the statue various senses one at a time, and you sort of analyze what kinds of thoughts this statue would be capable of on the basis of having one sense or all 5 senses or whatever. And so Condillac tries to show that you can develop all of the concepts or all of the thoughts that a human being is capable of on the basis of just having one sense. So you don't need to have multiple senses. You can just have one sense, and on that basis, you can form complex ideas in the same way as a human being does. What else did I want to mention? Oh, yes, that last bit. It's interesting here. The last sort of parenthetical comment about being able to count to 3. I don't know exactly what that refers to in Condillac, but it's interesting because I've recently been reading some stuff about psychology of mathematics, and it turns out that humans have a capacity to observe, to recognize the number of objects precisely for groups of 3 or less. So you can look at a picture of 2 dots, for example, and you can immediately see that there are 2 or 3 dots or 1 dot. You don't have to sort of sit there and count them, but once you get to 4 or 5, etc. dots, then you have to actually count how many there are, as opposed to just immediately seeing the number. So I guess Condillac sort of had an awareness of this, or happened to come across this notion, obviously well before there were any sort of systematic psychological experiments showing this. But it's interesting that he sort of happened across something that contemporary psychology of mathematics shows to be valid.
I'm glad you mentioned Locke, because not only was I just reading Locke yesterday and giving myself a headache about Locke, but also when I was reading this passage, that's the first thing that I thought of was Locke as well.
Yeah, there all of 18th century sort of Enlightenment philosophy definitely has a certain influence from Locke, and what a lot of the authors draw from Locke is this idea of testing complex ideas by sort of drawing them back, or retracing their genesis from simple ideas. And there's often a sort of reductive argument, in the sense that they want to say that this idea. So like some of the anti-religious writers that come up later on will say that our idea of God, for example, is a sort of empty idea, because we can't sort of trace it back to any set of simple ideas, or we can't sort of analyze it in terms of a genesis from experience in the way that we can for other concepts that they take to be more valid. So there's again this sort of critical or destructive impulse to the use of empiricism, or the empirical tradition in the 18th century, which certainly was not the way that Locke understood it. He obviously did not intend to sort of overthrow the existing social order, but that's I think the use that is made of Locke's work in the 18th century. Okay, let's go on to the next couple of short sections. Let's see. Yeah, we can read probably Bonnet and Hartley, and then probably stop there. I'll read from here, the next couple sections. Okay, Charles Bonnet. This same hypothesis of the statue with its signification relative to individuality is found in Charles Bonnet. It is worth noting that for Bonnet there is a distinction between sensation, properly speaking, and activity. The preference that the statue gives to the sensation that is most pleasing to it is an action that the statue exerts on this sensation. To prefer is not to act, it is to be determined and to act. Attention is a faculty distinct from sensation. Direct internal observation also possesses an undeniable validity, as the ideology of Destutt de Tracy and Mende de Biran will show. David Hartley. One of the authors who has best revealed this search for the individual as an operator of information, the creator of his own structures based on this activity, is David Hartley. The as yet superficial study of his thought reveals a very remarkable faculty of discovery in this man who wanted to extend Newton's discovery into physiology by explaining the connection of ideas through the universality of a dynamic schema, psychophysiological origin. Ideas are linked together by the same process as the one that links in the brain small vibrations retaining the tendency to be reproduced in the same order as the vibrations originally produced by the senses. One hypothesis of Newton's optics attributed the production of sensations to the vibrations of an ether contained in the sensory organs, the nerves, and the brain. In this sense, the individual is the center of an autonomous but non-arbitrary activity that connects sensation to a psychophysiological activity and connects abstract thought to sensation. This is not an empiricism here, properly speaking, since the unity and identity of the dynamic schema ensure a transition from the world to the subject, who posits in an extremely new way the rapport of the particular being to the universe. The individual is no longer isolated in a substantial aseity beyond which a contemplative knowledge would attain a participation in total reality. The contact between the universe and a particular being occurs according to a modality, which is neither a modality of activity nor of passivity, but of communication. This thesis is new. It safeguards the particularity of the subject without locking him into himself. It in fact defines the individual being as one in whom and through whom an operation of relation is effectuated. It is the operation of the individual that is an operation of relation. The individual is not substantially isolated from the world. He is inscribed in the world through an operation that distinguishes him not as a complete being in its aseity, but as the author being of an operation of relation. Individuality is the structural identity of this operation repeated on different levels. The psychophysiological relation, the relation of sensation and of abstract thought, then becomes not the problems, but the expressions of this reality that the individual is, an active reality of relating. The still quite imperfect state of physiological knowledge in Hartley's time did not allow this author to pursue his research into the details of psychophysiological organization, but his hypothesis conserves an important meaning as a representation of the individual's reality. There's one small point of, editing, I guess, more than anything else. So where it says in the section on Bonnet, where it says right at the bottom of 612 to the beginning of 613, it is to be determined and to act. I think that should be, it is to be determined to act. So the thought here, as far as I can tell, is that the statue preferring one sensation over the other or directing its attention to one sensation over the other is a kind of action. Even if it's an internal action, it doesn't have any realization in the external world. This preference for one sensation over another is a kind of action. So I think that's the meaning. But the translation follows the French text. But I think there's an error there, whether it's Simondon just made an error in writing, or the editors made an error in transcribing, or I'm not sure exactly what happened. But yeah, I think it makes more sense if we read it that way. And this passage on Hartley I think is interesting. Hartley is someone that I have only the vaguest knowledge of, more or less that he existed is about all I know. But Simondon seems to have a pretty positive evaluation of Hartley's work, even though obviously a lot of the physiological ideas that he's developing turned out to be incorrect, or that they weren't retained by later physiology. I think this idea of a kind of unity of the subject in the world through this psychophysiological activity. I think this is something that Simondon sees as a kind of a good idea that was not really realizable at the time that Hartley is writing, when physiology the nervous system was basically just a supposition that there's something in the nerves that that sort of transmits signals in some way. So there wasn't a lot of knowledge about the actual functioning of the nervous system, and it was all sort of supposition at that point. And so he the way he depicts Hartley here, and again, I don't know how accurate this is in terms of representation of Hartley's work itself, but the way he depicts it here is that the individual for Hartley is only has a sort of relative separation from the world, or is only relatively individuated, and this, of course, aligns well with Simondon's account of individuation, where the individual human being is only sort of partly individuated and always retains some sort of pre-individual charge within itself. And so Simondon is here attributing to Hartley a conception fairly close to his own one, which, again, I don't know how accurate that is, but it's interesting that he finds this sort of anticipation of his own ideas in this 18th century writer that he, as he mentions here, is not really very well known or studied.
I have a question about the Hartley part. There is a sentence kind of long sentence. I can't find the beginning. Maybe if you can find it, this is a new blah blah and going down, and then you can find the end of that sentence. You can see the individually is the structural identity of this operation repeated on different levels.
Right. Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. So I think this part is interesting because it kind of shows what Hartley thought about the individuality, something like that. And then my question is here on different levels. In what different levels is that the type of contextual or differences, or what kind of different levels here, or intensity of the process operation? What do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, that's hard to say because I don't really know Hartley's work. I don't know what exactly the different levels are here, but I think we can sort of connect this with Simondon's general account of individuation as proceeding through different levels, physical, vital, psychical, and collective levels of individuation. And Simondon seems to be attributing a similar doctrine to Hartley. So there would be, one form of individuation of as a living being, and then a sort of superposed level of individuation as a psychical being. So I think that's what Simondon is attributing to Hartley. And again, I don't know how accurate that is as a representation of Hartley's thought, but that's how I understand this passage that you pointed to.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. I think that makes sense.
Okay, so let's go on to the bit on Hume, and we can read both now as well because it's just one paragraph. So if someone else would like to read those two sections.
I can read. Hume. The dynamism of the individual is revealed in the philosophical method of Hume, who considers philosophical thought to be a strictly unconditional activity. Quote, when an opinion leads to absurdities, it is certainly false, but it may not be certain that an opinion is false due to the fact that its consequence is dangerous, unquote. Metaphysical studies do not have to justify themselves through their utility and attractiveness. Quote, and though these researches may appear painful and fatiguing, it is with some minds as with some bodies, which being endowed with vigorous and florid health require severe exercise, and reap a pleasure from what, to the generality of mankind, may seem burdensome and laborious, unquote. Philosophy thus becomes a critique that begins with man's appreciations and beliefs to seek out their principle through analysis and induction. Nevertheless, it may be said that this unconditional activity at least acknowledges a limit beyond which it cannot reach. The individual himself, insofar as he possesses the principle by which he evaluates. In the same way, and in the relation of the individual to the external world through sensation, Hume accepts the individual as a limit because he takes an impression for absolute and does not seek to go further than it. The associative relations between ideas do not require a physiological explanation, contrary to the intention of the Cartesians and Malebranche in particular. In the mind, order is maintained through the law of association, just as order in the universe is maintained by Newton's law. However, within the individual, the important point is the activity of thought. For example, error is explained by a confusion between ideas which occurs when, quote, the actions of the mind through which we consider them are not that different, unquote. This activity is completed through habit, which founds spontaneous belief and characterizes the imagination. And yet this doctrine, which places so much importance on the activity of the individual, cannot, due to its method, lead to a knowledge of this individual reality. The belief in the identity of the self as a permanent reality superior to the changing unfolding of impressions and ideas is unfounded. The notion of the identity of the self is no more concrete than that of the identity of external bodies. It is the imagination that creates the fiction of this permanence. Hume nonetheless states in the appendix to a treatise of human nature that this explanation is unsatisfying, that he doesn't know how, quote, our successive perceptions unite in our thought or consciousness, unquote. In ethics, the individual remains the center of relations and not isolated substance. Hume condemns Diogenes' crazed individualism or Pascal's isolation, in which he sees, quote, religious superstition or philosophical delirium, unquote. Vauvenargues. In turning to the work of Vauvenargues, we can begin to see a difficulty of attempting to define the individual within his limits. Vauvenargues gains an insight into the existence of an ideal of power, as much for intellectual life as for moral life. We are our passions, quote, which are not distinct from our being, unquote. The origin of our passions lies in the, quote, feeling of power, unquote, which we want to increase, and in the feeling of, quote, smallness and subjection, unquote, which we want to inhibit. Our freedom consists only in the determination of our acts by our thoughts and our feelings, i.e., by ourselves. Quote, it would be madness to distinguish one's feelings from oneself, unquote. Passion surpasses the limits of the individual. As soon as it is strong, it leaves aside our possessions and our well-being. The amour-propre, defined by La Rochefoucauld, is opposed to self-love, which seeks its happiness outside itself in the exercise of the passions that reveal, quote, the insufficiency of our being, unquote. In this sense, greed is, quote, the desirous instinct that calls on us to increase, to support, to strengthen our being, unquote. The love of glory, one of the strongest stimulants for great souls, gives us a natural authority over hearts and minds and incites us to work. From this notion, we can see how a certain definition of a man's worth or value arose, which is distinct from mere moral qualities, and which is formed by the potentials contained within the individual, thereby leading him to act beyond himself. The genius and heroism that characterize the human being, concerning what is most elevated in him, are the faculty of surpassing vulgar contradictions and inventing a solution to the most difficult problems, according to an act of absolute independence. For the hero, the rule is fidelity to oneself and to one's dominant passion. According to Vauvenargues, quote, everything that has some being has some order, unquote. It seems like he's saying in Hume, in a sense, the individual is absolute because there's nothing but the association of ideas. But in another sense, it's limited because, we can't really posit any kind of like absolutely substantial or necessary individual that has these ideas, precisely because we only have this association of ideas to start with and to build things from.
Yeah, I think that's right. So with Hume, there's always there's sort of his conclusions of his reasoning, which tend to be skeptical, where he suggests, for example, that we have no notion of real causation of one object bringing about or one event bringing about another event, or one property of one object being the cause of the property of another object. We have no idea of this notion, but then he always has what he calls practice. We can form these skeptical conclusions when we're sitting in our office writing philosophy, but then as soon as we step outside to get something to eat or go visit a friend or whatever, anything practical, we immediately have to rely on these notions that we a minute before sort of denied the validity of. So for Hume, these two, the individual has a different status in these two different sort of domains or different approaches. So in the philosophy, in the sort of systematic uh, self-understanding that Hume presents, we have no idea of the self as a subsisting entity. We're only aware of ideas and impressions, and they just have association through habit in various ways, and they are connected to each other through these laws of association. But we don't have any sort of idea of a self that underlies or unites these ideas, because precisely if we had an idea of it, we would only have this idea of the self and not the self itself, I guess. And But then outside of the domain of sort of systematic philosophy of mind or systematic philosophy in general, when Hume writes about politics or history, or, he wrote quite a lot on those topics outside of philosophical writing. He treats the individual as a sort of absolute, as Simondon puts it here. So he bases all of those political and historical writings on the notion of an individual as something sort of self-contained and given. So there's this sort of dual status of the individual for Hume, depending on whether he's in the realm of systematic philosophy or he's in the realm of practice. I put in the chat the link to the Wikipedia page for Vauvenargues because I only know of him through having read this Simondon text. I don't know his work at all. So he seems to belong to this sort of aphoristic tradition in French writing. This people like La Rochefoucauld or they sort of write these aphorisms about society and about the nature of the human being and so on, and tend to be sort of critical in nature. That's sort of and 61 has posted an example of one of these aphorisms from Vauvenargues. They tend to try to explain human action in terms of the interactions of passions of various kinds. And so here we have self-love as a kind of passion, and the sort of effects of this passion on human behavior. And so these are the sort of exercises that these French aphoristic writers sort of undertake is to analyze human behavior in terms of these passions that motivate it. Okay, so let's we should have read the Diderot section, I think. So let's read about a page, because there's the Diderot one paragraph, and then there's a couple pages on what he calls here philosophy of nature. So let's read like a page worth of those two sections if someone else would like to read.
Before going forward, can I ask a question about Hume, the last part?
Yeah, of course.
Because particularly focused on the last sentence, Hume condemned Diogenes' created individualism, Pascal's isolation, and like that. So what Hume believed that this kind of episode just represents like one habit of an individual, not that cannot represent like the human being's individuality or something like that. So Hume just tried to focus on like the particular action is to action. It doesn't mean like anything regarding individuality, something like that. That's the point.
I think the point here is that the individual for Hume is always thought of in relation to other individuals. So even though Hume in his sort of practical side, his thought is centered around the individual. He always thinks of that individual in relation to other individuals, and not so he doesn't sort of valorize the isolation of the individual in the way that Pascal does. He doesn't treat the individual in isolation from its social surroundings. He always thinks of the individual as as in relation to other individuals, and so that's what his sort of ethical or practical philosophy is sort of built around.
Right. So, okay, the last part, explained that way, that's perfect. And then the whole idea of humans, then still a human belief that the human beings, the how do I say, as it is stated, it's centered of a relationship, which means through the relations, each individual can develop some kind of individuality. So what I'm asking is, a human believes the independent individuality. Of course, what he as you said, it must be based on the relationship between each human being. But at the end of the day, what human believes are also the existence of individuality as well.
Yeah, so this is the sort of contradiction between his, I guess, speculative conclusions or the systematic conclusions. So when he tries to analyze our concept of individuality, he argues that we don't have any real idea of the self underlying the ideas and impressions that make up the mind. And so he denies that we have a true concept of the self or of the individual. But then when he turns to practical topics, he sort of accepts the common sense assumption of some sort of individuality as distinct from just the association of ideas. And so he sort of keeps both of these understandings of the individual in play depending on which domain he's writing in at a given time.
Okay, thank you. Let me read the tutorial part, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah, sounds good.
We see the emergence of different conceptions of individuality, albeit one based on the same inspiration with Diderot, who by way of physiological and biological reasoning show that individuality is not an ultimate or absolute reality. The survival of certain organs detached from the body, like the heart of a frog, gave rise to development of new theses. The Montpellier school, whose conclusions Diderot accepts, sees in the animal an aggregate of animalcules, which, when joined with one another, become the organs of the whole. There is no other unity in the whole than this unity of aggregation that incessantly varies and transforms without there ever being a veritable death. Continue, stop here.
Yeah, you can continue for about a page.
Okay, philosophies of nature. The philosophy of nature that is revealed in various ways in the 18th century brings about both an expansion and an abandonment of the limits of the individual being. Sometimes the individual being is connected to a natural world with which it is contemporaneous, and sometimes it is presented as a result of a long evolution. It is the object that the individual knows himself and contemplates himself or feels himself exist becomes the causes that surpass him. The philosophy of the Aufklärung also attempted to provide man with a oneness of himself, but it did not. It did so by showing him the objects that he elaborated and that constitute his own civilization. This closed domain of progressive and optimistic humanism does not concern itself with the natural objects, but only with the object elaborated and completely created by man, that which has human utility. It concerns itself with the institutions in particular, and considers the whole content of morals, customs, religions, language as something institutional, both annexed to the human domain, or that is human, and to be given the right to continue the work undertaken by past generations. What has been made by men can be unmade to be remade better. The humanism of the 18th century utilizes a doctrine of universal artificialism as an instrument. The individual being then appears essentially as the inventor or reformer, one who increases this human domain of manufactured or instituted things, or repairs it and improves it by replacing old institutions with new ones. Conversely, the philosophy of nature cannot limit the human individual to this voluntary and conscious task that is completely oriented toward the purely human domain. connects the individual back to a society that is not a pure institutional work but has something natural about it. Moreover, human society is profoundly a community, and the origins of human rights are found in this de facto set of the human community, which does not proceed from itself but originated with the cosmic becoming according to supernatural intention. Even within what seems purely institutional, the artificial has little place. Language is of divine or natural origin, but it does not result from a convention. Man is an individual, as a constitutive unit when he is a member of a contractual society instituted by man. But he is an integral part, vaster, more connected, less precise in his limits when he is a member of the facto community, since the fact is the source of right because the fact is natural. The individual then becomes nothing than everything, nothing by himself in his isolation, and everything through universal participation, which gives him an intuitive awareness of the world and the destinies of humanity in the world. Its nature is at the same time a supernatural nature, for it surpasses itself in itself, and the individual is these two things at the same time, because he is a simple unit and a being who participates. The traditions of Neoplatonism and Christian mysticism become mixed with certain influences that perhaps need to be connected back to the cult of mythos by way of long elaboration of initiatory sects. In the cult of mythos, the individual being is formed by sunlight, the first reality. Upon its death, the individual being dissolves again, progressively disappears into its elements. These elements are absorbed by the sun, back to which they ascend by following its rays. Here, the relation between the animated principle of beings and each individual being is a direct material and spiritual relation. In Platonism, this is a relation of exemplarism, which is also direct but without the exchange of matter. Both traditions and both conceptions seem to coincide in Germany initiatory philosophy and seem to be animated by the inspiration coming from Christian mysticism. This philosophy of the object is therefore profoundly different from that of the humanists of Aufklärung, the object in the presence of which the individual knows himself and becomes himself is something that emanates from nature. It's a reality and simple qua-reality in the ancient sense of the term. The symbol as a reality is separated from another reality with which it constituted the original whole and in which it enjoyed its true nature. This fragmented reality, isolated from the other, constituted with its twin a couple of symboli, being which, as they come together, symbolo, coincide by resurrecting the original being, like the two halves of broken amphora. The individual is conceived as a symbol, i.e., a being which, quite far from having its whole capacity of existence within it, is not completely given to itself and feels a kesra, a void, a lack, which is the result of this separation and the sign of the absence of the other symbol, the individual's complement with respect to the absolute. Symbolism is a philosophical and mystical conception of the individual well before being a poetic doctrine. The search for the individual's complement, after which the self discovers that it's incomplete and frustrated, leads to a bringing a quite particular attention to science. Science becomes the indices that permit a particular being to rediscover it's a complementary symbol, and therefore to attain absolute unity. The veritable individuality does not possess in this existence because it has been paradoxically divided and separated from itself and is nothing more than half of itself. The feeling of incompleteness becomes an instrument of discovery, the first step in the metaphysical ascension and the migration toward the being's unity. This metaphysical symbolism finds an expression in French Romanticism a century later, particularly with Lamartine, where he expresses himself through uninspired Platonism in search of the soul sister. We find the metaphysical feeling of incompleteness Chateaubriand, where he expresses himself in a reverie in search of the slight fade, was so then in an ideal elan, with the beginning reflection postulated this complementary being, and the veritable individual is the couple. since Eva is at the same time the double, the sister, and the wife, and she is also the world itself. Quotes. You push man by the arm, he gets up armed, end of quotes. But it is undoubtedly with the Jihad Nehwal that the conception of the individuality is more clearly inspired by an initiatory philosophy of the symbol. Throughout his life, Jihad Nehwal always searching for the complementary being. Within the unity of this complementary being fused and merged the image of the mother, quotes, lost in the cold mist of the north, end of quotes, the image of Adrien, the descendant of the Valois, the image of Aurelia, who magically grows up to the limits of the world, the image of the young girls, the daughters of fire, whom Jihad Nehwal tries desperately to identify their images with one another, and ultimately the image of the Virgin Mary and the saint, or the priestess, and the witch, and finally the fairy. This complementary being is one and multiple according to singular circular tree that makes it such that the images replace one another through a continual substitution that is only possible due to a basic identity. Quotes. The 13th returns. It is still the first. End of quotes. And this alternating and the recurrent image, animated by the continual rhythm, quotes, like the alternatively white and pink star of Aldebaran's constellation, end of quotes, the opposite aspects fused together, quotes, the size of the saint, whatever, the crisis of the fairy, end of quotes. The search for the complementary being is expressed in life by a will to return to the origin of the things, the origin of a being, to the locus, the oldest civilization, the place from whence the day comes. And it's a madness. Nehwal traveled towards the Orient. In the 18th century, the main precursors of this metaphysical symbolism of France are Rétif de la Bretonne, and the Sénégouro, who are themselves preceded by Diderot.
Right, thanks. Yeah, that was a long section. I thought we were going to split that up into separate parts, but yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so here we have, so we had this, there's a sort of strange division in the way that Simondon talks about Diderot. So he has one little paragraph that we just read, and then he has this long section on the philosophy of what he calls the philosophy of nature. And then he has another section on materialism where he talks about Diderot, Diderot again. So I won't go into the Diderot section. We can look at the bit about what he calls the philosophy of nature. And it's not 100% clear to me who exactly he has in mind when he talks about philosophy of nature, because normally when we talk about philosophy of nature, where normally that term is used to refer to the work of Schelling and people associated with him a little bit later at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century. But here he's referring to people from the 18th century. One guess of who he might be thinking of is Herder. So he had a kind of evolutionary philosophy of the natural world. He has forget the exact title, but he has a book, Ideas Towards the History of Man, I think is the title. It's a book that sort of starts with the formation of the solar system and of the Earth, and then proceeds to show how human being arises in this evolutionary progression. So here Simondon sees the particularity of this philosophy of nature as being this sort of integration of the human being into the natural world. So the human being is has its reality outside of itself in that sense. So it's the human individual is not a complete being that has its own reality within itself. It always sort of points to something beyond itself. And then he brings up again his sort of favorite notion of the symbol as this reality that is split or separated, so that one half sort of points towards its completion in the other half. And so he takes it that for this philosophy of nature, the human being is a symbol in the sense that it sort of points beyond itself to something outside of itself. And then there's this very strange suggestion here that we have to read this philosophy of nature or understand this philosophy of nature as a sort of continuation of the cult of Mithras. And so Mithras was the Mithras cult was a sort of religious school in the late Roman Empire. I think it has Asian origins, if I remember correctly, but it's as a sort of cult of the sun, and it was an initiatory sect. So you had to be initiated into this tradition before you could learn about its doctrines and practices and so on. Why exactly Simondon brings this up is not entirely clear, but he reads what he's calling here philosophy of nature as a kind of initiatory philosophy, and he connects it. So probably a more historically tenable connection is the connection with Christian mysticism. So people like Boehme, for example, had an important influence on 18th century and 19th century German philosophy. So Christian mysticism was definitely an important influence, even on like people like Hegel, who tries to. He's definitely a rationalist. He tries to develop a rationalism that can account for some of the ideas of mystical Christian philosophy in the form of Boehme. And what else do we have here? And then we have again this sort of strange anticipation where Simondon skips ahead to French Romanticism, which only really developed in the 19th century. And so he talks about some of these French writers, and especially Gérard de Nerval, who have this sort of romantic conception of the search for the missing reality. So the individual is sort of always longing for this complementary reality that would sort of complete the individual. And there's various forms that this takes in Gérard de Nerval's work, whether it's the mother or the saint or the fairy, or all these different sort of images that are used to depict this missing reality. So I don't know exactly why Simondon sort of puts the text in this order. This whole passage is pretty strange, I think, in terms of like the things it connects and why it appears at this point in the text and so on. Right? Yes, the famous pet lobster that Gérard de Nerval had.
It just just a guess is like the philosophy of nature. This century is the century of Charles Darwin, and then in terms of natural sciences, the evolution theory came out around this time.
Yes. So toward the end of the 18th century is when we first see evolutionary theories appear. So Lamarck is, I think his Philosophie zoologique comes out in 1800, if I remember correctly. So he has an evolutionary theory that is built around the notion of effort. Living beings make efforts of various kinds, and the whole sort of structure of the natural world is defined in terms of this sort of effort of nature to produce these living beings, and then the sort of famous part that gets retained from Lamarck is his idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So he thinks that the efforts that a particular being make in its lifetime will be inherited by its offspring, and then those offspring will have characteristics that are determined by the effort of the ancestor. And so, like the stock example that's always used is the sort of proto giraffe, or the ancestor of a giraffe was constantly making an effort to reach the highest branches of the tree, and its offspring inherited a longer neck, and this process continues over centuries until you end up with a giraffe with a long neck. So this is one of the evolutionary theories that was around in the late 18th and early 19th century. And also Charles Darwin's grandfather, I believe, Erasmus Darwin, was writing, I think, at the end of the 18th century. He has a long poem, what's it called, Zoonomia or something like that. And in this poem, he gives a Zoonomia. That's right. So he gives a 1794 to 1796 is when it was published, and he gives a sort of evolutionary account of the development of animal forms, but he doesn't give the sort of Darwinian mechanism of natural selection in that text. But yes, there were definitely evolutionary ideas that were sort of in the air at this time.
The reason I just refer to the evolutionism is like I'm wondering like that has to do with the limit of the awareness the his or her own like a limit as a human being, and at the same time like the kind of like a limitless like a possibility of evolution. What I'm thinking is like maybe like this time would be the kind of boundary in between like the two different contradictory ideas. So like try to find like what really what should be really true like in terms of like an ontological question regarding that issue like the cult of a Mithra. So in a way, this kind of like a circulation like human beings are from the sun and then going back to the sun again, but that kind of a cycle human being at the moment could be a limit to has limits like in terms of existence, but that kind of circulation is like the idea the human being as a collective concept, it goes on and on like a continuity. So it's kind of like a beyond like the limits of human being, something like that. It's just like a pure the genuine guess. Like I'm not sure like whether it could be true or not, but I just guessed that way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things that come to mind here. Is so this conception of the individual as a symbol in the sense that Simondon uses it, so as a partial reality that points beyond itself. I think we can, you could have different conceptions of what the other half of the symbol would be. So in Gérard de Nerval, it's always another person. So it's the mother or the saint or whatever other figure. It's always this other person who is the other half of the symbol. But you could also have an understanding of the symbolic nature of the human being that would point towards, I guess, something like a collective in Simondon's sense of the term, so that the human being would be incomplete as an isolated individual and would always point beyond itself to the collective. And I think that's Simondon's conception is something along those lines. And so this conception of the human being as a symbol is a sort of open one. It allows for, I think, multiple different ways of manifesting itself.
But then what do you think about the signs? Like in the middle of the text, like there comes a signs again. Actually, it was discussed the previous like part, the role of science, like how it contributes to the how to say growing individuality or whatever. It comes again here, like
Yeah. So the signs here. I think we can understand. So the way Simondon depicts them here is the role of signs in romanticism in people like Gérard de Nerval is to sort of point towards the lost reality or the complementary symbol, the other half of the reality that makes up the individual. So the sign is always something that points towards that lost reality. And so I think the sign here is always understood in that sense. I don't think he's thinking of like linguistic signs in, I guess, a sort of structuralist sense.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think maybe we can end here since we're getting close to time, and the next section is well, it's not that long, but anyway, we can end here and pick up the naturalism section next time. So we'll see. He's going to come back to Diderot a little bit, and then he's going to talk about D'Holbach and Helvetius. So yeah, we'll see some of the pretty interesting French materialists of the 18th century that yeah, I don't think get a lot of attention, but they have some interesting points that are worth reading, I think.
Sure.
All right, so
That
thanks
sounds good to
everyone
me.
for coming out, and hope to see you next week.